Hello and welcome to the Sonic Cinema Podcast. Thank you for joining me. As always, my name is Brian Scuttle. You can find my written work as well as the podcast in general at www.sonic-cinema.com. And you can also check us out at the Sonic Cinema Podcast YouTube channel, where you will get quick takes on some movies, film festival coverage, filmmaker interviews, and as well as the podcast itself, which you can also find at Apple, Spotify, Good Pods, basically wherever you listen to podcasts, you will find the podcast. You can also check us out at patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. There you will get episodes of series like Leaving the Collection and Life Soundtrack, as well as First Watch reviews, and a lot more. That is at patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. So this is an episode that has been a couple of years in the making, and it's one that I really am excited to finally get to with my guests tonight. I've joined them on their podcast, Nostalgia Cast, a couple of times over the years, and they've humored me in talking about a Halloween film as well as a Francis Ford Coppola adaptation of a John Grisham film. And uh, one of the things I wanted to do with this episode, because their podcast Nostalgia Cast deals so much in the idea of what constitutes nostalgia, what drives us to have nostalgia for the things that we like, and I wanted to approach that in this episode, but from a slightly different angle. Whether rather than focusing on movies that we grew up with that were contemporary at the time, I wanted to look at films that we were introduced to as children or teenagers that stuck with us. But first, a introduction to our guests. Please welcome to the podcast Jonny and Darin from the Nostalgia Cast. Thank you very much for joining me, gentlemen.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I know we kept putting this in, oh, we should do something. And yeah, you're right. It was like years ago.
Yeah.
So we're finally getting around to it.
Yeah, I mean, I've and once I hit on this idea, it was really one that I knew I wanted to do, especially as the podcast itself is kind of lean more into classic films and older films. And I one of the things I love about the three films that we chose, each of us chose one, is that they could not be more different, but they do all harken back to a form of filmmaking that really doesn't exist now in terms of the style of filmmaking, the type of films that are being made. We rarely see this type of film be made. But before we get to those films, Darin and Jonny, what was the impetus to create Nostalgia Cast?
Well, I wanted to do a podcast for a while. And so when I tell this story all the time, in 2006, we had Superman Returns and Cars that hit theaters. And those were, for some reason, they really hit the nostalgia button. Like Cars is the part where they think about, like, they dream back the Cars back when their town was, Radiator Springs was lively and before the freeway was built and passed them by. And then Superman Returns is obviously built on nostalgia, like heavily built on nostalgia for the 1978 Superman. Some would say straight jacketing it. I would say,
Mm-hmm.
but that just struck me as, well, that's a nice thing. Like, what about movies that, like, kind of struck us as kids? Like, how would we look at them like now? How would we approach them differently? And so I thought about putting a podcast together, and thought, no one wants to listen to me just talk about myself. So who in my life could I possibly get to talk about movies that, and who I grew up with since I was a teenager? Who could I get to talk about movies with me? And so Johnny was the obvious answer. So I said, hey, do you want to do a podcast? And Johnny was like, yeah, sure. So that's really it. I'm thinking that's it, right, Johnny? That's the basic skeleton.
Well, from what I remember, the reason why you chose me is because I could write a jingle for your podcast.
Oh, right. That's right.
Who has musical talent, so that's why my name came you're, you know.
Right.
Because I was like, yeah, you're right. I have musical talent. I can do that.
Right. And then I didn't have money to pay you, so I just asked you to co-host with me. I think that's how it worked out.
Yeah, also, I think I'm better looking too. So there's that.
Oh, well, sure. That's what your wife says anyway. So yeah, that's basically it in a nutshell. We're just, Johnny and I just taking movies that. What is it, Johnny? Our attitude is if you see a movie in a $5 bin at Walmart that you haven't seen when you're a kid, it's $5. It's the price of what was a rental, I guess. So you just grab it and watch it, and then what's the difference between now and then? Is it rose-colored glasses that kept everything? And I don't know about you, Johnny, but like I think the only movies that I just clouded my judgment, I think it was Transformers the movie and Popeye, that I couldn't walk away from them thinking they were bad movies. And I think those are the main problem. I don't know, were there any movies like that for you that we've
Well, yeah,
recorded?
I mean, yes. I can't think real right now, but what I was going to say was, sometimes these movies we talk about, they just don't hold up, and sometimes they do. But when you approached me about the podcast, the first movie that popped to mind was Clash of the Titans,
Right.
and so that kind of like was what. I mean, yours was Jazz Singer, right? Because it was
Yep.
something that you would see when you were younger and you wanted to revisit. And Clash of the Titans popped to mind right away, and I was like, why did I think of that one? But anyway, so that's kind of been our premise: just kind of go back and watch movies from our childhood and see how they hold up. And like I said, sometimes they don't.
Yeah.
Right. But we think we're as objective as you can be. We Johnny and I kind of pride ourselves in not being what is the word, like kind of childish or we're trying not to stick to. We try to be honest about our feelings. I guess that's how you would explain it. We don't want to be gripe about things. We don't want to hold on to things too tightly because nostalgia can be, we can weaponize it in different ways. I think in bad ways and good ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely the concern that a lot of us have when it comes to the way Hollywood has plundered our childhood, for lack of a better term. I think, you look at some of the properties and some of the remakes, reimaginings, whatever you want to call them, that get made and greenlit, and you can't help but think of why. I mean, obviously, it's because it's a name that we're familiar with, so they want to bank on that name a being a benefit to them when in tapping into that nostalgia. I mean, yeah, I think looking at films from our childhood very clear-eyed is beneficial. I mean, as goofy as it was for the three of us to talk about Rad, that the reason that stuck out to me is because it really got to what you guys want to do on your podcast, where it's like looking at a movie from your childhood that you had affection for now, how does it hold up? And for me, even though I will always have a certain degree of nostalgia for that and a certain amount of affection for it, I can recognize all these years later it's not a very good film. And there's just way too much of it. I know the tropes of the genre so much, and it's one of those things where it's like, oh my god, this is such a lazy version of these tropes. And but it was fun to be able to talk about that with you guys, and I think that type of, like you said, an honest assessment of what we liked as kids and how we feel about it now. I mean, obviously we're going to feel differently about it because we're in a very different part of our lives than we were at the time. So, being able to look at some of those favorites of ours, whether it's a movie that is considered an all-time classic or something that just connected to us for some reason, I think that is important for us to be able to look at that film and realize, is this as good as it was at the time, or does it have flaws that I'm just now seeing for the first time?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, Brian, when you first joined us for Rad, and when I told Darin that I put Clash of the Titans, he knew right away that I got the premise for the podcast
Yeah.
for the show. When you told us you want to do Rad, we knew right away you got the premise.
Yeah.
We're like, he gets it. We know he knows what this is all about. So we were glad you came for that episode. It was a lot of fun, and also we enjoyed having you on Rainmaker too. That was fun too.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. When I told Johnny about it and I said, well, I'm doing this movie, do you have a movie in mind? And again, Johnny said Clash of the Titans. I'm like, yeah, he's my perfect co-host because
Yeah.
I don't mean to, I'm not trying to attack or demean our past guests, but sometimes we have to talk a guest out of a certain movie because if someone picks Star Wars, sure, you're nostalgic for it, but I'm like, well, it's the same, it's not, the initial premise of the show is that it's not, I don't want to do movies that we watch consistently. Sure, you're nostalgic for Star Wars, but I don't want to do something that you've watched 3 times within the last 3 months, right? Because you know it inside and out. It's not, that's not what we're talking about. We want to be able to kind of process it and see, are we nostalgic for something that we haven't watched? And so you mentioning Rad, Johnny mentioning Clash of Time, just like you said. And again, it's funny because Johnny and I think I was going to say something like this, but Johnny kind of jumped on it first, so I'm glad that he did. But that's the kind of friends that we are. But if you get that, then yes, that's what we want to talk about. And it was only gradually because obviously Jaws is very formative for me. I didn't want to talk about Jaws because what can you say about Jaws that thousands of other people haven't said? But I do want to say that slowly over time we have introduced stuff like The Princess Bride or It's a Wonderful Life, or again we just did '90s movies, which Johnny and I honed our skills, I guess if you want to call it, our movie watching skills on those movies, which are movies that we have watched multiple times, and we do have. But in that case, it was, well, let's not just concentrate on obscure sports movies from the '80s. Let's try to do like movies that people do actually like, and we can still be nostalgic for those things. And yeah, there's Star Wars. I might not want to do that, because there's so much discourse that's going around. But
Yeah.
there is the nostalgia for movies that we love. That's the same thing as nostalgia for movies that we remember loving but might be different now. And again, the greatest movies are the ones that we watch and we learn different things from.
Right.
And so every time we watch it, we're different. Every time we watch it, we learn something different. And then for 70s Blues, we kind of had a different attack. Johnny, what was our attack for 70s Blues, our 70s season?
Well, there were a lot of movies from the '70s that I hadn't seen, classic movies that I hadn't seen, like Apocalypse Now, Deer Hunter. There's some others we're going to do in the future. But I just was like, I haven't seen these movies. I need to watch these. And so I said, let's just do movies from the '70s, and so that's kind of where it stemmed from.
And that too, since Johnny is it's an interesting conversation because Johnny's attacking these formative '70s films from a first person perspective, first time viewer, and then I'm, honing my movie watching in the '90s. I did watch all of these as part of, like, I guess the craft of becoming a film buff or a connoisseur, I guess you could say. So it's fun for me going back and revisiting these movies that were formative for learning the language of film. So it's a whole new conversation that we're having, and we're having a good time with it.
Yeah, and it's been fascinating to listen to your '70s ones, and I love the idea of, and I do this too, and it's like I get excited about this too, especially if a guest comes up with a movie or a topic that they want to approach that it's like, oh well, I haven't seen that movie, or I haven't seen that movie, so it gives me an opportunity to watch it for the first time and be curious to see how I'm going to respond to it from a degree of, okay, I've heard this is a great movie. So do I feel like it's a great movie? And if it is a great movie, what is it that I see in its greatness? And I mean, a great example, last year I had a friend of mine, Chris Esper, on. We talked about, he was the one who brought up the idea of talking about John Cassavetes. Well, Cassavetes is a bit of a blind spot for me. So I watched the films that we talked about, and it's like, oh my God, his work is fantastic. And you can see the connective tissue of his work to the independent films of the '70s, '80s, and '90s. And I love that. I love those challenges um, we give ourselves to not just talk about the things that we love or the things that we're familiar with. To your point, Star Wars. It's like, apart from the discourse, there's so many other. How much more can you say about Star Wars that people haven't said 10 million different ways? Now, obviously, it depends on who you're talking about and the ways that movie connects to you. And it's funny because of the fact that you were talking about talking guest out movies, and famously, like, one of the movies I brought up for 90s Palooza was Braveheart, and Darin, you were like, yeah, I'm not sure if I really want to do that. And I completely understand the reasons, because, I mean, it's one of the reasons why it's tough to talk about pretty much any Mel Gibson movie right now. And you guys did end up doing it anyway, and I was still fascinated to hear what you guys had to say about. But for me, I love that we ended up talking about the Rainmaker, because even if it's not a movie that I would say is one of my favorites of all time, of the Grisham movies, it's always a movie that for me has stuck out for several reasons, even though it's not necessarily my favorite one. I think there's some interesting things in the way Coppola tells that story. Plus, it gave us a chance to talk about Coppola, who I had really not had too many opportunities to talk about. And now you guys are on your, third film of his talking about with After the Godfather and Apocalypse Now. So, I mean, I think, I think it's definitely fascinating to and I think it's good to be able to check somebody and go, yeah, you know what, I'm not really sure about that. I mean, it was just a random happenstance that you ended up talking about the movie anyway, and but I think it led to a more interesting conversation than we might have had we tackled Braveheart, the three of us.
Yeah, that's what happens when you don't tell your co-host what movies that you don't want to do. Because again, Johnny went to our childhood friend Jason and asked, and Johnny didn't know. And Jason said Braveheart, which is his favorite movie, and so naturally he's going to pick that one. Actually, Johnny picked it for him. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, we had a conversation about that from his perspective, and so there was no kind of Brian. I think I guess I was just too comfortable with you that I could say no, I don't want to do that. But but again, it was See, the thing is, if we talked about Braveheart, I don't know if we would have had a chance to broach, like you said, that topic of Francis Ford Coppola.
Yeah.
And I mean, Johnny, was The Rainmaker one of your first Coppola movies? You hadn't seen Apocalypse Now. I think you'd seen The Godfathers.
Yeah.
Where did The Rainmaker? Was that one of the first ones you watched of his?
No, I don't think it was. And it's not one of my favorites, like Brian. I don't like that one as much as his other movies. But I want to say The Godfathers were the ones that introduced me to Francis Ford Coppola.
Yeah.
Right. And if we hadn't broached that, we wouldn't be able to talk about it. Again, talking about 70s movies, there's no way around. I mean, during the 70s, it was Coppola and Spielberg and Scorsese and Lucas and De Palma. They were so heavy in the rotation that it's hard not to talk about those. Mm-hmm. But, being able to approach, that's what we're doing. We're not just tackling those classics. The Rainmaker was a solid movie.
Yeah.
It still gave us the opportunity to talk about Grisham adaptations and the choices that are made in these lesser films from these greater directors. So I thought that was a fun conversation to have, especially from that 90s perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And, getting to 70s movies, we're going to start. I mean, I've already brought up the subject of this, which is the idea I had for this episode was the idea of each of us choose a film that we watched either in our childhood or in our teenage years that, for one reason or another, that predates us in terms of coming out before we were born, that somehow we latched onto. And the first movie I want to talk about is a 70s movie. It is 1973's The Sting, the Oscar winner for Best Picture, directed by George Roy Hill, the second collaboration he had with Paul Newman and Robert Redford, as well as Robert Shaw as the villain, and just an absolutely amazing cast. This is Johnny's selection, and I was wondering if you could, before we really start to get into it, get into some of the reasons why this ended up being your selection.
Yeah, okay. Well, when Darin told me your idea for the episode, it didn't take long. I mean, I came up with the sting almost right away. And again, I wasn't quite sure why it came to mind so fast. But then the more I thought about it, I thought, well, when I was younger, my mom was a big Robert Redford fan, and she also liked Paul Newman. And so, and actors like James Garner and that kind of stuff. So we would watch all these old movies like A Man from Snowy River and The Natural and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. She showed me The Sting when I was like 11 or 12, and I've only seen it that one time. So I've only seen this movie twice. But for some reason, when I was 11 or 12 and I watched this thing for the first time, it always stuck with me. I was like, I just liked the aesthetic of the movie. I liked the way it looked. I liked the feeling I got when it was over. And I never watched it again. I'm not sure why I didn't go back and visit it again, but I didn't. And so that's why it came to mind so quickly, because I was like, well, that's a movie that predates me, and that's a movie that I've always been fond of. Not really sure why I'm fond of it, but I know I liked it, and so I wanted to watch it again. And I mean, yeah, I mean, that's why I picked it. But it sure was a lot of fun watching it again. I gotta say that for sure.
Yeah, this is just an absolutely wonderful film. So it basically it stars Newman and Redford as two different con artists, and what we see is throughout the film we are seeing them go through these different cons, and they are all tied into the character of Lonigan, played by Robert Shaw, and he is a crime boss who is after Redford's character Johnny Hooker, but he doesn't realize necessarily that he's after Redford's character. And Paul Newman plays Henry Gondorf, who is who ends up being Johnny's mentor and helps him on the con of Lonigan. Is just a wonderful collection of cons that really allows this cast, and this is one of the things I love about this movie. There's at least one more in here that this is the same thing, is that we lost something in movies when the the idea of having casts that are like 10 to 12 significant names deep did not become the norm, did not remain the norm. And I think this is just one of the wonderful examples of it. And it's one of those things where, like I said, this is another film from George Roy Hill, Robert Redford, and Paul Newman after Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. It's like if you have different ideas of which one of these you prefer, I certainly understand why. I understand why you appreciate one or the other. I do think for me, I do prefer the Sting just because of the style and the very uh, warm tone that this has.
Yeah. Yeah, I've always been a big fan of con artist movies. I always like watching the con artists kind of find the mark and and just make the play and all that stuff is so fun, so intriguing for me to watch these kind of movies. I think that's the reason why this movie stood out to me, because I knew it was a con artist movie, but I forgot what the con was. And so to go back and visit it was like, oh yeah. And what was so great about it? Like watching this film and then not be given everything all at once. Like I love it when a film shows you something and then you gotta like kind of stick with them and you gotta stay with it. And then they reveal something else a little bit later. And then they have another twist that comes up later on in the movie. And then the final reveal, the big twist at the end is like, oh yeah, this is why I liked it. It was so fun. And I have to say this too. I gotta give a shout out to David S. Ward, I think, is the screenwriter.
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh my gosh, I love this script. It's so well crafted and it's so smart and it just seems so realistic. And I miss scripts like this. I miss, the dialogue, the quickness of the back and forth with the characters, and like it's just so smart and so clever, and it's just so engaging. The whole movie, I was like, this is so fun. I was like, I love this movie. I mean, there might have been one weakness in the script that I can think of. We might talk about it later, but the character who's is it Selina? Is that the name of the assassin lady?
Loretta, yeah. Loretta's
Yeah,
her cover name, right?
yeah. I kind of feel like that relationship could have been built stronger. They could have had more, just more together with Hooker and that character, so that when she does betray him, he finds out that she's the assassin, it could sting a little more. You know what I mean? Like it could hurt more. But it wasn't like that. So it was kind of like, okay, it's a cool twist that she's the assassin. Then again, you're like, well, it doesn't really mean a whole lot because I mean, she's like, I don't even know you, but I'll sleep with you. I don't know. I kind of feel like that should have been built up more, and then that would have been better payoff when she was, assassinated.
Yeah.
Or they just could have cut her completely out of the movie, and it wouldn't have really had an impact.
Yeah, but I think you would like that kind of element, that relationship element in the movie, because it was lacking that. And so when it did start to show up, I was happy it was there, but also she's not a very attractive woman, in my opinion. So it was like they could have gotten somebody a little more attractive for that role.
Well, I thought it was interesting too because I was watching it. I do agree that the only weakness of the script is it's a little bit padded. I don't know if it needs to be 2 hours and 10 minutes long.
Yeah.
I was thinking about, if you could cut anything, that little Loretta thing or the Selina thing, it's kind of an added twist that, again, I don't necessarily think it needs it. If you're trying to build a movie that appeals to the four quarters or whatever, it's like, yeah, you want to have a romance in there. But I do like that they do have that montage after Johnny sleeps with her, and then it also shows, cuts back to shit, I'm forgetting his name. Cuts back to Henry, and he's with Billy, the Eileen Brennan character. And I just think it added a sense of normalcy. Like Billy wakes up and she's like, "Come on, come back to sleep or knock off," right? And he's like, says something to her, and she's like, and she's knows his life, knows his mind, so she goes back to bed. But I like that it kind of hinted that there's a life outside of the stinging, outside of the cons.
Yeah.
So if anything, I like that was at least in there, and it had that kind of nuance to it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this was a movie I know I watched in part because of the fact that my mom was a huge fan of this and Butch Cassidy. She absolutely loved both of these movies, but it's really a movie I think I ended up watching on my own just because I wanted to catch up to it. And it's just such a sharp script. The word script is rightfully considered one of the best in Hollywood history. And I mean, you're right. You don't really get this type of writing. And one of the things I love about this, and it goes to some of the best heist movies, some of the best con movies, where they end up showing you so much more into terms of what the end game is going to be for this story than you realize while it's happening. And that's one of the things I absolutely love about this movie. And I think the Soderbergh Ocean's 11 does a wonderful job of this as well. And basically, but I also like that, the reason Hooker goes to see Henry is because of the death of his mentor, Luther.
Yeah.
And one of the things I love about that is that in this movie that's very light, this very fun, but also has some serious parts, Luther's death has very significant weight and meaning to where it really is, in a way, it is a wake-up call to Hooker, like, oh shit, I need to make sure I'm doing things in a certain way because otherwise I'm going to end up on the wrong side of this and end up dead.
Yeah, they did a really good job of establishing that relationship between Luther and Johnny. And I liked that even though he wasn't on screen for very, very long period of time, you got to feel their relationship and what they've been through together, and you felt that. And so when Luther dies, you're like, oh man, it was devastating. And so it also gave Johnny the Hooker the motivation to do what he did and to perform the long con. But also I have to say this, it was so fun to like, um, I mean when Luther was speaking, I was like, that sounds like somebody I know.
Yep.
Wait a minute. And I was like, holy cow, that's James Earl Jones's dad.
Yep.
So I was like, I know it's not James Earl Jones, but it sounds just like him. So
And it looks just like it. Well, Brian, you're right. It's like when Luther dies, the way that they handle it, there's weight to it. There's stakes. Now there's something. It's not just that, yeah, we want to see, Johnny get his revenge, but we also know that people can die. Like, it's serious. Like, people can be murdered. And so it gives it kind of a weight that otherwise a lot of con movies don't necessarily have. What I really like about this movie is, I don't know if there's any written rules on the con movie, and I bet there were con movies before this, but yeah, you mentioned Ocean's 11, and that's the movie. Watching it this time, I was like, this is like Ocean's 11. This is a prototype of Ocean's 11, or all the con movies that we watch. I love that we're introduced to Johnny and Luther with a con. Like, we don't know they're working together, and then we find out because we're conned into their con, right? We fall for it. But then it does, it follows the exact format that every great con movie does. It lets you in on the scheme, it lets you in on who the bad guys are, it lets you know how they're going to trick him, and then certain things don't go right or they do go right. But the master stroke of the script is that it keeps certain things from you. So as an audience member, you're not always there every step of the way. So by the end of the movie, where there's twists, like the big twist of the movie, especially with the FBI agent, it's like, oh, like, we've been tricked too, like, we've been conned. That's the fun of it. It's not just watching the con get pulled off. Because again, in Ocean's 11, it's the same thing. When Danny gets kicked out, it's all a con to kind of get Luther, or Lucius, I can't remember his name, the Matt Damon character off the top of my head. But like, it's all a ploy to get him more involved and have him step up to the plate. So again, it follows all the patterns of what I love in great con movies, where you have to be with them, but you also have to fall for their traps, like they keep things from you, and then at the end there has to be that big twist, and I think it follows all those so perfectly. It's so smart and so well done, getting you involved in that story.
I have to say this real quick. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I have to say it was a blast watching the poker scene when Paul Newman goes into that poker scene.
Yeah.
And he just plays up that character, and he's just I was having a blast watching that. It was so much fun. I'd forgotten all about that. In fact, most of the movie I had forgotten. So I was like, oh yeah. So yeah, watching that poker scene, man, it was hilarious. And also, I was pretty impressed because when I was watching the card tricks being performed, you're like, okay, that's got to be a double doing those card tricks. And then with no cut, and it's Paul Newman doing it. I'm like, oh. The same thing happens in Color of Money when you're watching them play pool. Like, you'll see a trick shot be performed, and then the camera pans over, and there's Tom Cruise and Paul Newman doing the trick shot. And you're like, oh, they're the ones actually doing it. So that was kind of fun for me too.
Well, Brian, don't forget your point. I don't mean to interrupt you being interrupted, but like, that's the magic of movies, right? Yeah, like, you think you've got it, like, oh, this is a double, and then when they pan up, I don't know if there's a cut. It's pretty seamless, so I'm assuming it was Paul Newman. And I was like, oh, that made me buy into the trick, right? But Johnny said something interesting. I know I've seen this 3 or 4 times, and it's interesting that I don't remember certain things that happen. Like, every time I watch, I don't remember the FBI agent. There's this part I was like, is he part of the con? Like, I forgot some of and I don't know if that's part of the movie's joy or if that's a flaw. I'm just, it was an interesting watch because I know I've seen this multiple times, but it still managed to trick me.
I think, I think part of it comes from the fact that I mean, while 3 or 4 times does sound like a lot to some people to watch a movie, when you consider, it's probably been decades ago since either of us first watched this movie, it kind of makes sense when you consider all of the other movies we will have watched in the meantime. It's like, even as great as this movie is, it's not the easiest thing sometimes to, we sort of think about the feeling of what the movie made us feel more than the mechanics of how it did it. And I think to a certain extent, I mean, that makes rewatching it after several years, more fun because of the fact that we allow ourselves to be surprised. I mean, yes, there can be something to be said about the sport of trying to watch a movie as many times as you can, just absorbing the movie. And but at the same time, it's like there's also something to be said for watching a movie, really letting it wash over you that first time, really finding yourself enjoying it that first time, and then realizing the next time you watch it, it's gonna feel fresh because you
Yeah.
haven't just driven it into the ground. And so, it's like and it really gets to, I think, Johnny, what you were saying earlier when you were introducing the film and why it wasn't, even though it was an easy choice for you for this. It's like, well, why is it? It's been a while since I've seen this.
Yeah, and I think this goes back to like you were saying, how they were able to create a feeling, and like I said, that feeling stuck with me for decades, and I always knew that I liked this movie. I just didn't know why I liked it until tonight. But yeah, I will say this: you do say it's. I think someone said it, but it's not a perfect movie. I mean, it's pretty close, but it's not perfect. I mean, to be a little bit critical here, the very first opening shot, that tracking shot where you're following the runner's feet when he's going into to the place to get the money, and it goes up the stairs. The tracking shot's kind of jerky and it's kind of bumpy, and there's some camera shakes and there's some weird moments. And I was like, "We're gonna start like this." I was kind of surprised because after that shot, all the other tracking shots weren't. They were smooth. They weren't jerky. They weren't bumpy. And so I was like, how come that first shot didn't make it? You know,
Right.
well, what happened there? So that was a little bit off-putting for me. And then I mentioned this in our when you joined us for Rainmaker. A lot of the fade outs or the dissolves, the transitions that they would do in the editing, um, I'm not a big fan anymore. I used to like them, but I don't like these swishes and swipes, and when the frame shifts upside down or whatever, it fades out. I
Yeah.
don't like those kind of things anymore. It always takes me out of the movie. I just want a straight cut to the next scene. Just keep me going. So whenever it does that, I go, oh yeah, I'm watching a movie. I forgot. And I don't want to experience that. I want to go. Just keep me on the roller coaster.
Yeah, that's it exactly. When they do the flips, it's reminiscent of a card, like flipping over a card, right? But when they do that, it keeps you. Oh, it's a movie. Like it keeps
Yeah.
reminding you it's a movie, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It just depends on how you watch it. I just noticed too that there was a bunch of ADR. Like you could tell that they had to record some of these lines of dialogue. Like it was obvious a lot of the time. Sometimes you could tell it was a set. Like you could
Yeah.
the way they would add things, or sometimes when the Shaw character is eating his breakfast or whatever in his hotel room, like the scrapes of the fork and knife didn't seem to match what was going on. So there are interesting little flaws throughout, but I think it is all about that feeling. Like Johnny, when you talked about like how it made you feel and you don't remember, I agree with Brian. As out of the two Redford Newman movies, I do prefer this one, and it comes down to a really weird thing. I think it comes down to the difference in the music score.
Mhm.
Because I love Butch Cassidy. It has the William Goldman script. It's obviously either smarter or just as smart as the David S. Ward script. So all that is perfect. But the Burt Bacharach songs, it seems so anachronistic, or at least it seems anachronistic what we think about westerns, that every time that music or the songs play, it takes me out of Butch Cassidy. In this one, the way that Marvin Hamlish adapted the Scott Joplin songs, it's very of the time, and I love listening to the music. It's so fun, and I just they can play it slow, they can play it fast, to kind of suit any kind of mood that's going on. I noticed that they slowed it down when Johnny decides to go visit Loretta for their first tryst overnight or whatever, and it slows down a little bit, and it shows, anyway, so it shows all that stuff. That score, it just seemed very correct for the time, and it just added to that sense of fun and that sense of kind of tinkly play that the movie has. And that score is, it never took me out. It always added to the mood, it added to the tone. I just think that score makes all the difference for me. I love the part with again, Johnny, you mentioned where they're watching the Newman character like flip cards, and then he like makes a mistake and they fly everywhere. It's like, don't worry, you just worry about your hand, kid. And Redford goes, if we ever get to it. It just has that banter. They're so fun together, and I gotta say this: Redford and Newman are two of the most beautiful people to ever grace a movie screen. I just love looking at them and watching them.
Yeah, Newman's eyes, man. He just has these piercing blue eyes. It's like, oh my gosh, where'd those come from?
Yeah.
But I was gonna say, what was I gonna say? Oh yeah, okay. So the song, the Entertainer. I agree with you. I think that's great, and I also love that it's kind of you see these Norman Rockwell-esque paintings in the chapter titles, like
Mm-hmm.
the where it says the Sting and all that stuff. I think that just fits so well together, and it just
Yeah.
again creates that feeling, that mood that they were going for with the film. So
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I think the artificiality of this film is a positive for it because
It's kind of like a play.
it is, and I think it goes to it really is harkening back to the 30s, the 40s crime films where you felt like even if you believed the world, you still realized that the world was fake. You realized that was something that was done on set. And I think the way that, because let's face it, I mean, if you tried to do this in real locations, it would feel like a very different movie. I think the artificiality of the movie is a big part of why we believe the tone and why. And I love the fact that it's like, it's funny because of the fact that when we think of Redford and Newman, we think of them as actors from the same generation, right? I mean,
Mm.
and we feel that they're kindred spirits from a similar generation, but the way that they make us believe that Newman is this great mentor who's been around for years while Redford is just getting started, it's such a credit to the makeup, to the costumes, to the way they do the production design. It's just such a wonderful credit to the craft that went into this film that we believe all of these things that we have, intellectually speaking, we may have a hard time believing in another movie.
Well, just to get meta for a second, movies themselves are a con,
Yeah.
right? It's a con job that's being put over on us. So the artificiality, I think, kind of, I don't think that was their intention, but when you watch the movie, you're aware that it's a movie. But that's what all movies are. You're being told to believe in something that's fake, and it just depends on how well the trick is done that makes you believe in the movie. I just think, yeah, you're right. I think it works for this movie, that you're aware that it's a movie, but you're still having fun with it. You're still aware that it's being written. You're still aware that it's being acted. But that's the whole point of movies. It's just fun that way.
yeah,
Would we? Because I know you guys have talked about Jaws on your episode on your podcast. Darren, I know it is a fundamental movie for you. How? Where would you? I there's a part of me that wants to put Robert Shaw's performance as Lonigan in this on the same level as Quint. I mean, obviously, I do feel like Quint is more iconic, but I think in terms of what Shaw is having to do in this film and the pure menace of him in this film, it's something that is as impactful, I think, in terms of this movie, making this movie the great movie that it is as his Quint is in making Jaws the movie that it is.
John, what do you think about? That's interesting. What do you think about his Shaw's performance?
I thought Robert Shaw was great in this film. I love that character. I did have he seemed like his accent came and went sometimes.
Yeah.
So, but other than that, I thought it was great. I mean, it was so funny. Like again in that poker scene, listening to Newman get his name wrong all the time. That was cracking me.
Making him angry.
But watching Robert Shaw, like just his thought process, man, it's just so masterful, so well done.
Well, it's kind of a thankless role because all Shaw's there is to make Lonergan look like an idiot and just
Yeah.
have him you fall for all the pranks, right? Which you would look at it as an actor and think, well, that's not very fun. But that's part of the con. Like you want to play kind of the patsy.
And Johnny's right. Like, you can see his thought process. You can see him seething over whenever Henry gets his name wrong. Every time you can see him, his jaw clench, or his eyes clench.
Yeah.
It's really funny. There's a lot of nuances to Shaw's performance that you have to watch for. Like, it can seem like a bland performance. Even the limp. I know that he hurt himself playing some ball game or something like that. And I think George Roy Hill asked him to kind of incorporate that into his character. So even that's just kind of a choice that he added in there. But yeah, you can look at it as a thankless role on the surface, but I think Shaw adds some stuff to it. He doesn't get the equivalent of the Indianapolis speech in this one, but he's still a lot of fun. Or the equivalent of punching Sean Connery in the face, which you also know Robert Shaw from a James Bond movie. But I do think he is fun.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned the music, the Joplin Rags that Marvin Hamlish adapts. It's such a wonderful score, and I mean, it fits so. It's funny because of that you mentioned Butch Cassidy and the Burt Bacharach, and it's like those songs are so iconic in terms of being a fundamental part of that film that that movie is so charming, we almost forget to a certain extent just how anachronistic those songs are, because they're very much of the time of when the movie was made. And yeah, I mean, the choice to go with adapted piano rags in this is just absolutely right. It helps create the world, and I think that is the thing that ultimately does set this thing up slightly more than Butch Cassidy, is the fact that we just experience this world in a very authentic way, as artificial as it is, as intellectually as we recognize the artificiality, we believe it in a way that Hollywood sometimes doesn't respect nowadays, and it's really a shame. And even with con movies, even with heist movies, you still have to believe everything of those movies in those movies, and I think that's one of the things that The Sting does that makes it such a great film, that is something that we, even if we don't remember the exact A, B's, and C's of the plot, we understand the feeling that we had in watching it.
Yeah, it's fun. I mean, that's all we're really looking for in a movie, right? Is just to be entertained.
Yeah.
And you hear that it was a big box office critical success, and you sit and you watch a movie like this, and yeah, I can see why. I can see why it is hit with an audience.
Yeah. Johnny, did you have anything else to say about this thing before we move on?
I guess I will say that it was also fun to recognize, is it Ray Walston?
Yeah.
Uncle Rupert from Rooster's Millions? That was fun for me too.
Mm-hmm.
Uncle Rupert. So,
So we continue from The Sting. We go to another Oscar winner for Best Picture. This is Darin's choice. It is 1965's The Sound of Music, directed by Robert Wise, starring Julie Andrews and Christopher Plummer. And Darin, if you could set up with us why this ended up being your choice.
Just to preface it, this might be the shortest conversation we have about a certain movie. It's not because I don't love The Sound of Music. It's just, Brian, when you kind of mentioned what the point of this episode was, I thought about, well, what are the movies that my mom introduced me to? Because again, like we talked about many a time on Nostalgia Cast, my mom is like, being raised as an only kid by an only mom, she just wanted to make sure that I had all the best stuff. She wanted to make sure that I liked James Bond, that I liked Transformers, that I had all these things that boys should like. But she also gave me the choice, so she kept letting me just kind of broaden my horizons. I say all the time that she was a Tupperware dealer, and one night, very distinctly, I remember her leaving me with Lethal Weapon and Friday the 13th to watch on VHS, which are two very different movies, but they are very formative in that, well, why would my mom leave me with Friday the 13th? And then also Lethal Weapon has become kind of a comfort movie for me because I've loved it since that first viewing back in the late 80s. Mm-hmm. But when I thought about that, yeah, my mom introduced me to all these things.
she didn't specifically say to me at any point, "This is my favorite movie," or "This is what I think you should like." She just put things in front of me and then let me decide. And so, me falling in love with Jaws and falling in love with how that movie was made and the history of it, and falling in love with the book, so that she would take me every weekend to a book nook, some kind of book fair, just to buy me a copy of Jaws. I think I had dozens of copies just because I was so infatuated with that and with the book. So when I thought about that, like movies that she did kind of latch onto, I thought about movies like Flash Gordon or Footloose, movies that we'd already covered for Nostalgia Cast and talked about in depth there. So I actually asked her and said, "What were there any movies in particular that you tried to show me or that you loved as a kid that you want me to talk about for this podcast?" And Sound of Music was the one that she mentioned, just because it's like, yeah, I've always loved Sound of Music, and I think it was a fun one to introduce you to musicals and things like that. And then I remember a little while back too, my dad, he started downloading all these movies, and he found Sound of Music in a high def copy, and he downloaded it and was like, "Darren, I got Sound of Music. Have you seen the Sound of Music? It's a classic, Darren. It's a musical. It won Best Picture." I'm like, "I know, Dad, I know." So, but he was so proud of it because that was one of his favorite movies growing up. So, Sound of Music, even though it doesn't, like I said, she didn't have a particular. If I asked her what her favorite movie was, she would just tell me the last movie she watched, just because that's how her mind thinks. Which
Right.
is, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just my mom. That's what I love about her. She just gave me the choices. But I've always wanted to talk about Sound of Music because it's always been, watching it as a kid, revisiting it as a teenager during the 90s when I wanted to kind of either acquaint myself or reacquaint myself with movies. It's a strong contender for one of the great musicals. Not, and we'll talk about it. The first half is really silly, and it's probably syrupy, happy, syrupy sweet to the point where it's like, I don't know if I like this, but the way that it builds to that ending, and there's such power in those last 30 minutes
Yeah.
with the Nazi party. That's again what we go to movies for. You're just all over the place, and you get all sorts of feelings. But yeah, that's a long-winded way of saying that's why I picked Sound of Music, just because I have so many choices. We'd already talked about ones that I would consider like in my heavy rotation that my mom actually sat me down, but her loving this movie and just being a part of showing it to me, I think that again it ties in with just letting me decide what I would want to watch and what I would kind of gravitate to.
Yeah, and it's funny because of the fact that you have, you have a connection of this with your mother to a certain extent, and actually I kind of do too. But so I've talked about it before. My mother was an actress, and she did community theater when we were up in Ohio. She did extra work when we came down to Georgia. And in community theater, one of the things that she did, she played a nun in a stage adaptation of The Sound of Music. And so it's even though, so I don't remember if we watched the movie. I remember watching her on stage play in The Sound of Music. I don't necessarily remember if we ever watched the movie. So my memory of the movie is fairly hazy. So, when I watched this, this was one of those viewings where I watched it kind of basically feeling like, okay, this is kind of my first official real time watching it, because I don't remember when I watched it, if I even watched it. So we're just gonna call this the first time. So, but it's funny because of the fact that it's like there are things that obviously are omnipresent in film history in terms of Julie Andrews singing on the mountains, and the songs in the Rogers and Hammerstein score, and and then of course the meme that is thrown out very frequently, unfortunately, of Christopher Plummer tearing up the Nazi flag. And it's interesting to see. This is the type of musical that we just. I mean, Rogers and Hammerstein in general is not really the sort of musical that we get anymore. And I think in part of that is because of the fact that Disney is so omnipresent when it comes to the idea of what contemporary musicals are, even though they're really just borrowing from traditions of what Rogers and Hammerstein did. And but the thing is, it's like this movie, even if it's like the first real time I thought I watched it, this movie, I get why people think that this is just a warm movie to watch for them. Like it feels like a warm bath. It feels like a comfort movie. It feels like a movie that if you're down, yes, it's tonally very silly at times. For the juxtaposition of that compared to the last 30 to 40 minutes, as you mentioned, Darin, it's weird, but you get the character through line, especially between Julie Andrews and Christopher Plummer, and it just makes things, and we suddenly feel like we've gone on this journey, as seemingly random as that journey has been.
Yeah, Jonny, I know that you've had a little more in-depth experience with The Sound of Music. Do you want to talk about your life as an actor and your experience with the play?
Sure. Before the play, let me say real quick. I do like this movie, but I will agree with you, Darin. Like when you do watch it, it is kind of silly at first, and so it always takes me a minute to get used to that silliness and to get used to it. And then once I get past that, then I get more on board with what's happening. And it is. You're right. It's very it's a very warm movie. It does make you feel good when it's all over. And so I appreciate that. I do like this movie. I like Julie Andrews. I think she has an amazing voice. So all of that, put together, it makes for a really fun watch. But Darin, we've mentioned on our show several times that you and I were actors, in junior high and high school, and we did a lot of theater. And one of the plays that I was in was The Sound of Music, and I was a smaller part, a Nazi, so I was, it wasn't very long, but I learned a lot about acting while being in that play. And there was the actress who played Maria, right? Or
Yep.
Maria. Yeah. Do you remember her name? I don't remember
I
her name.
don't. I was going to ask you who played her. Yeah,
Yeah,
I know that it was J.D. Ramey that played Captain Von Trapp, right?
yeah. Yes. And I forgot the name of the actress, but I remember just like being backstage and watching her on stage and just like watching her reactions and the subtlety she put into everything. I learned a lot, and I was like, oh, that's how you do it. You know what I mean? Like I went, that's how you portray this emotion or that emotion or how you get that across. And so I remember just like studying her and watching her and being like, okay, if I'm gonna be a good actor, I gotta do what she's doing, because she's nailing it. And again, it was just fun to be a part of that experience and to do that. And also, when I think about The Sound of Music, I think about other experiences I had with it. As far as like, my sister was in a dance troupe once. We went and watched them do this, this whole dance thing, and they sang the Alvida Zang song. Um, at one point, and that always stands out to me when I think about The Sound of Music. And then our mutual friend Jason, who came on for Braveheart, he actually played Rolf in The Sound of Music, and I remember going to see that, and so that anyway, yeah, a lot of good experiences with it, a lot of good theater stories and memories to go along with it.
Yeah, you mentioned the silliness, like some scenes that I just can't abide. Like I think it's really happy and syrupy before we have a chance to kind of kind of slip into its shoes, so to speak. The part where Maria's singing "I Have Confidence," she's singing on the bus, she's singing like walking down the road. I always laugh when I say that because I'm like, why aren't people reacting to this weird woman just singing? Like on the bus, it's like if that was real, that woman would be like, "What?" And people would be telling her to shut up, like to stop singing. And then when she's running down the street twirling, it's like, how come nobody's staring at this woman? I know there are people walking around. Why is nobody staring at this woman like she's a complete nut job? So, and then Christopher Plummer shows up and he's wearing lipstick. It's kind of hard to kind of align yourself with what's happening. But then gradually, like again, and then you have some great songs. You have The Lonely Goat Herd. You have a few of my favorite things. You have all these songs that even though they're syrupy sweet, when I watch this movie in the house, I love having these songs echo through the house. It's just joyous, right? Where it's not something that like you're gonna have I'll have in an album and listen to on my phone, but it is nice to have that kind of echo through the house and kind of have that feeling just kind of pervade. So in that way, I think it's a great movie in that it warms you into everything, and you know the characters. By the time the Nazi stuff comes in during that second act, you can feel the weight kind of, and they hint at it for that first half. But
Yeah.
then when it starts becoming unavoidable, sorry, like the Nazi party being out there in Sweden or wherever, in Germany, being just having that feel of the weight of their presence just becomes stronger and stronger and stronger, to the point where there's literally no escape. They have to escape to the mountains. That's very realistic. It's a very strong feeling to have. And if it wasn't for the character building we had up to that point, when Plummer rips down that Nazi flag, it's like, oh, if we hadn't been invested in these characters, the movie wouldn't be working this way.
Yeah. No.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. And I mean, it's funny that you were talking about the idea of her singing in public, and people were like, well, why aren't they reacting to her? But I mean, the thing is, though, it's like I feel like that is a reaction based on, to a certain extent, what musicals have become now, right? I mean, musicals do more of that, trying to be somewhat realistic in how characters relate to other characters, just bursting out singing. And that wasn't necessarily the case with Rodgers and Hammerstein, or Singing in the Rain, or West Side Story. Like, that just wasn't how it was portrayed in musicals up until that point. So I wasn't necessarily thinking about that, but now that I am thinking about it, it's like, yeah, I understand why. I understand why that might be something that you look at as like, really, how is this not happening? But I think a good part of it also comes from the fact that, typically when characters sing in musicals, is very much in close quarters, in whether it's by themselves or with one other person, or with a group of people in an isolated house or a room or whatever. So the idea of seeing somebody burst into song with all these other people around them, you're not quite sure how to react to it. Yeah, I think, but you're right. If the character dynamics don't work, that have been built up for that first hour and 40 minutes of the movie, the last hour plus is not going to engage us, because we know, and to your point, the Nazi stuff is basically, it's in the background, but gradually coming into the foreground by the time we hit intermission. And so after we hit intermission, we start to really see the German takeover of Austria. It becomes more of this omnipresent thing, where it's not just the emotional stories that we need to be engaged with, but the personal stories of how this family is going to escape.
Yeah, there's a hyper reality to this movie. I said that there's a couple of things that I don't abide. First of all is when she's singing, nobody looks at her. The other thing is when she dresses those poor kids in the drapes.
Oh my god!
And I'm like, it brings out my inner bully, because I'm like, I want to give every one of these kids a swirl. I don't know what it is. I want to beat these kids up. And I feel bad for saying that, but it's like, oh man, why would she? But that's mothers. I guess she's doing a very motherly thing. But we're talking about the artificiality. There's a difference, like, and I think that's the difference here. You hit the nail on the head. Is when you see people in the background, it's different, Johnny, right, from a play where everybody's involved in the choreography, everybody's dancing, so it feels like you're enveloped in it. I think of like Enchanted, like the How Does She Know musical number.
Yeah.
And everybody is just inexplicably joining in, and it's like, oh, this. And by the end of that song, you feel like it's magic. You feel engaged in it because everybody else is. In this one, where you just have people walking around like it's normal, I think that's the difference. It's like, why are people reacting? If they've been joining in dancing or singing along, that would have made a little bit of a difference for me, I think.
Yeah,
but
totally better, yeah.
Yeah, I would have sold it, but I don't know. I just always thought that was funny because why aren't they saying anything? This crazy woman is just strolling down the street, shrieking at the top of her lungs, and nobody's committing her to an asylum, right? But that's the thing. It's like eventually it does win you over, so that you do buy into that whole family and that dynamic and escaping into the hills from the Nazi regime, because that's a very universal kind of feeling.
Yeah. No, exactly. And yeah. Oh my God, those costumes that she puts them in with the drapes. Oh my God, I felt so bad for them. It's like, what is that design? But I mean,
Well, in Enchanted, when Giselle dresses herself in the dress, you see her like it's actually cut out from the drapes. They treat it like a joke, so at least that's funny. But here we're supposed to take it sincerely with these poor kids.
Well, and the
Just
thing
like
is,
bully fodder.
but the thing is, it's like I think this is it's. But I mean, the reason she does that is because it's Maria trying to do what she knows what to do, how she
Right.
knows what to do to engage herself with these kids, and these kids who are brought up in a very rigid household with their father being very regimented, very strict. I mean, they're not necessarily thinking, "Oh, well, this looks ridiculous." It's like, "Oh, this is different from literally anything that I wear at home otherwise."
Yeah.
So it's having them come out of their shell around Maria, and Maria sort of showing these kids, "Oh, this is the type of person I am," and that's where I think it works. But yeah, I mean, this movie, the character dynamics are absolutely right. Robert Wise is a really great unheralded filmmaker. He's directed some absolutely fantastic films in a wide variety of genres. I mean, he's done horror with Curse of the Cat People. He's done science fiction with The Day the Earth Stood Still and Star Trek the Motion Picture. He did musical with this. He's done so many wonderful films, and this, you really see why this is very much in class by itself when it comes to movie musicals at the time.
It's interesting too that Ernest Lehman wrote the script for this, and Robert Wise also directed, and he wrote the script for West Side Story, which Robert Wise also directed. And I can't think of two more diametrically opposed musicals.
Yeah.
And I think Wise directed Sound of Music to suit the subject matter. Same reason he shot West Side Story the way he shot it. Mm-hmm. They're two, even though they're made by the same director and writer, they're two very different animals. That's another thing that I just love. It's like you wouldn't be able to tell it's from the same filmmakers. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's the sign of a good director, is that he can kind of sink into any genre and kind of make them work. Suited to the subject matter, suited to the story he's telling. I think that's important.
Yeah. Yeah, Johnny, do you have anything else you'd like to say about Sound of Music?
Well, just that it's not one that I regularly put in and watch.
Right.
But I do watch it when it's on TV. If I happen to catch it, I will watch it. But it's not something that I run to. Mm-hmm. But I still enjoy it.
So I think maybe the last thing I'd want to say about it, the magic of movies we talked about with this thing, I wanted to, for some reason, I wanted to quote, it's a very famous quote from Pauline Kael on The Sound of Music. Her review of the movie, she says, "The success of a movie like The Sound of Music makes it even more difficult for anyone to try to do anything worth doing, anything relevant to the modern world, anything inventive or expressive." And that's a very Kael statement. And a lot of people look at that and again, maybe rightly hate her as a critic, but I think it's very her, but it also speaks to what movies are. Like, sometimes you give yourself to a movie wholly, sometimes you don't. Like, Pauline Kael did not like being kind of conned, again, to bring this thing into liking a movie. Like, this thing is they're making it knowing that they're charming, right? You see Robert Redford smile, and it's like, oh, you're going to be charmed by that. So she was kind of put off by that. She's obviously put off by the syrupy good feelings that this movie gives off. But that's up to you how you decide to watch a movie. Like, you can look at Kael and hate it, and hate her for saying that. But I kind of look at it and laugh, because it's like, yeah, this movie can have that effect. Any movie can have that effect. We're all subjective. We're watching them in different ways. It just depends on how you let it soak in with you. I know that a lot of people don't like musicals because they can't abide people breaking into song, but that's really no different from an action movie, people breaking into an action scene or shooting at each other, right? It's kind of the same aesthetic. I just think that's a very interesting statement, particularly about Sound of Music, that, yeah, it can be syrupy, it can be sugary sweet, it can be overbearing, but there's also a lot of truth to it. And when the reality sinks in, I think that's the power of movies. It's up to you to decide whether you're going to be sucked in by what it has to say or not.
Yeah.
I will say, I have to be in the mood for this movie. I can't watch it if I'm not in the mood for it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if I'm not in the right mood for this one, it just doesn't work for me. But if I'm like, yeah, I can watch this one. Okay, then I can enjoy it.
Right.
And I think that's something that is, there are movies I absolutely adore that, to your point, Johnny, if I'm not in the mood for it, though, I just am not interested in watching it at that time.
Yeah.
Even as much as I love it, it's like, am I really in the mood to watch something like that? That's why, it's kind of a joke, the idea of film buffs having hundreds upon hundreds of movies in their disposal, whether it's physical media collection, whether it's via streaming, and you have a hard time figuring out what you want to watch. It's because you have to be in the mood to watch something to to be able to appreciate. And I think that is a great. And I agree with you on Sound of Music. It's like, trying to watch a 3-hour musical. It's hard to watch a 3-hour anything nowadays. But as much as, and it's like, I love watching it. It was a wonderful experience. But it's like, if I'm going to, that's a commitment to have that experience. And it's like, you want to save that for moments where you're in the mood to have that experience.
Right.
Yeah.
So that brings us to our final film, which is not a Best Picture winner.
Yeah, how does that feel, Brian?
You know what?
Best Picture winners.
You know what? I feel pretty good about it, because honestly, this is honestly the movie. Part of the reason why I wanted to do this subject, because this is a movie that I have very fond memories of as a child, and it really, as I've watched it over the years, I recognize more and more that it has so much to do with the individual that I am, in terms of my sense of humor, in terms of what interests me in movies and what interests me in performances. And I'm talking about Frank Capra's 1944 movie Arsenic and Old Lace, based on a play by Joseph Kesselring, adapted by the Epstein brothers, starring Cary Grant as a theater critic who comes to discover an unexpected secret about his dear aunts. And this is a movie that, this is one that is all my mother. Like, Cary Grant was her favorite actor. Like, her favorite movie was North by Northwest. She adores Charade. She adores Philadelphia Story. She adores An Affair to Remember. And Cary Grant is just the movie star for her. And the thing that I love about this movie, the thing I've always enjoyed about this movie, is the energy of it. It is a breathless hour and 58 minutes. So I do have that on you guys. I chose a movie that's under 2 hours. I will say that. But
We appreciate it.
But this is a movie that I just have loved since childhood. I love it's the silliness of it, the weirdness of it, the scary elements of it, and it's the dark humor really is something that glad I've connected to, and as much as movies like Mel Brooks's Young Frankenstein and Spaceballs and stuff like that, an Airplane, these are though Arsenic and Old Lace is a movie that really kind of it really kind of solidified the type of humor that I would gravitate towards as I got older.
So, Jonny, was this your first time watching Arsenic and Old Lace?
No, I'd seen it before. And like you, Brian, my mother introduced me to it as well. She was a big Cary Grant fan and she liked this movie. But I didn't see the movie first. I saw the play first.
Oh
Wow.
wow!
And yeah, I remember watching the play and just loving it. It was so funny. And like you say, the energy, it was just as high in the play. The way they did it, I was just like, I couldn't wait to watch the movie after watching the play. And again, it's kind of like this thing you mentioned, it was kind of like watching a play in a way. It's the same thing with this movie. I felt like I was watching the play. But you can't deny the energy, and it was just so fun. I do like Cary Grant in this role. I think he's the right person for this part. And I love the old ladies too, by the way.
Yeah.
They didn't they originate? I think they originated the play.
Yes.
Like they were on and you know, what are their names? Like Josephine Hull and Gina Dare, right?
Yes.
And then also Boris Karloff would actually play Jonathan on stage, and he couldn't get out of his contract to show up in the movie, which I thought would have been funnier because comparing Jonathan to Boris Karloff, it was actually Boris Karloff would have been funnier. I think it still works. This Brian, I direct messaged you. I was like, if I told you that I watched Arsenic and Old Lace before, I was flat out lying to you because I've never seen this before, and it was an amazing experience. Especially because I just tweeted that I watched Clue for the first time, like from 1985, which is a huge blind spot. And I'm kind of kicking myself that I've gone almost 40 years without watching that. It was sorry, John, what was that?
Is that Clue was part of my childhood for years.
Same.
And when I told Jonny that too, he was like, I don't know how that's possible that you haven't seen Clue. And I was like, yeah, I don't know why either. But it was just, I can't tell you the pleasure it was watching Clue and Arsenic and Old Lace within a week of each other. And they're kind of similar. They're very play-like. They're very kind of hell's a poppin'. They're crazy. Like nothing really makes sense. It's just a bunch of random stuff. But it's the commitment that everybody has to their performances, I think, that completely sells these movies. And you both mentioned the energy of this. Holy crap. Like, that's what made everything. So you didn't have time to pause and go, what's happening? Because you're just so caught up in everything. And it breaks my heart to hear that Cary Grant thinks this is one of his, I think this is his least favorite performance that he's ever given in a movie.
Yeah, I heard that story, yeah.
And I'm like, because he said he wasn't used to that kind of acting the way that Capra kind of pushed him to it. But I was just having such a blast. We're so used to seeing him be so suave, even though I think he was an acrobat before. And he's so suave and he's so cool. He's charming and he's funny, but like seeing him just be kooky, crazy, and just his manic expressions and his energy was just keeping everything together. This is one of my favorite Grant performances, just because I didn't think he had this in him, like all this energy. But what's great, and we'll talk about kind of the film noir look of the movie, but what's great is that he's so manic that the part where he actually sits down on the stairs and is just sitting out the craziness that's going on off screen, and he's like, nope, I'm not involved with that. Oh, that's kind of, that wouldn't work. That wouldn't be so funny if he hadn't been manic the rest of the movie. I think it's a crazy performance, but he's so, I think maybe because it is Cary Grant, we just buy it, but he's so funny. Like, everybody's so funny around him, but it's like, was kind of just a breath of fresh air watching Cary Grant just go crazy and sell every moment, I think.
Well,
hey, Darin, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I think the thing that is interesting about this is that this is a screwball comedy. This is ultimately a screwball comedy. It's ultimately farce in very much the same way that Clue is. And I think that is, and comparing the two, I think is very valid because of the fact that I think Tim Curry essentially has the central performance in Clue, right?
Yeah.
Where he's the one basically orchestrating everything around him, just the same way Cary Grant is as more Brewster. And I love that the beginning of this movie where he and Elaine are getting married, and that's where we see the Cary Grant that we're familiar with from films like Philadelphia Story, from films like bringing a baby, and his girl Friday. And but as we start to see him realize just how screwed up everyone else is around him, and it starts with Abby and Martha, and yeah, Hall and Adair, they were on play. They played it on stage too, and they're just absolute delights in this movie. And I don't think I will ever get over just how sweet and wholesome they are, and how just almost naively sociopathic they are about what they're doing. And it is just a pure delight because they see themselves in, and it's funny because of the fact that they root it in they're giving back, right? They're giving back to these lonely people who they don't really seem like they have anything going for them, so they're just going to kill them and put them out of their misery. And it's really dark, but at the same time, the way they do it, and they're respectful of the people they kill, and that is the wildest juxtaposition of these characters, and it's just such a wonderful. It once Mortimer is aware of what's happening, it just gets progressively harder and harder for him to keep his cool, and it just every little step up until the end just is turning the screw towards lunacy for him, and it is a fantastic performance by Cary Grant.
Yeah, I would say this is definitely my kind of humor. I love this kind of dark humor. And I also will say this. My wife and I have big dreams to one day own a theater. And I'm always thinking about which plays would I do if I owned a theater. And I was, producing these plays. And Arsenic and Old Lace is definitely on my list for a play that I'd like to produce or direct.
Mm-hmm. Well, isn't this one of the biggest sets that was ever created? Like, they created the house, they created the street, they created the cemetery next door, which is fun. They have a cemetery just right in between their houses.
Yeah.
But they created this set so that it was, and I think even the rooms, I know they're Uncle Teddy or whatever, you never see him go inside his room, but I think they shot some stuff inside everybody's bedrooms. You just don't see it. So it was an elaborately built set, and so that's what's impressive too. And it's built for aesthetics, right? The way that the banister is kind of like prison bars, that kind of thing. Again, watching, it's interesting that all three of these movies kind of that we've talked about have a play connection, but it is fun watching them be creative with a play setting. Like, how are they going to switch it? How are they going to be fun with it? What cool stuff can they do? The Saul Polito cinematography, there's a shot when Jonathan is talking to Dr. Einstein, and by the way, I must have turned away when Peter Lorre's name came up in the credits because I did not expect to see him. When he walks into the room, I'm like, that's Peter Lorre, and I was crazy. I love this guy, and just seeing him play like the alcoholic kind of nebbish kind of guy. But the shot where Einstein's talking to Jonathan, it's just that shot of Jonathan's looming giant bulbous head, just enveloping Einstein. It's just so threatening. I'm like, this, I didn't expect there to be some fantastic looking shots. I love that when they turn off the lights and it's all dark, you can't see anything. When the girlfriend comes in, I think the Steiner score plays the wedding theme. So even though we can't see who it is,
you know exactly who it is.
I thought that was just a brilliant choice. We know that Elaine has walked into the house. We know that she's in danger. It's just, there's so many. Again, I think of Capra in his later years. I think of It's a Wonderful Life. I think of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. We kind of forget that he did. It Happened One Night. We kind of forget that he has this manic kind of comedic energy to him. And so it was refreshing just being reminded of that watching this movie.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Darin, I was going to say, I think there's a rule that when you say a Frank Capra movie, you have to say Frank Capra's Arsenic and Old Lace.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
To say his name on top of the movie.
It's contractual.
Yeah. This is absolutely true. I mean, Massey and Peter Lorre, I agree with you, Darren. It would have been absolutely hilarious if they had been able to get Karloff for Jonathan.
And
But
every time they say it, Jonathan gets more and more pissed off. I am
yeah.
not
but
Carlo.
but Massey and Laurie just play so well off of each other. I love that Laurie I love that this character is playing off of our familiarity with Laurie in stuff like the Maltese Falcon, sort of like it is with Cary Grant, where it's kind of playing off of his persona that we're used to, but in a very different way. And so, like, Laurie is a long way from the menacing killer in M.
Yeah.
He's a long way from the schemers of the Maltese Falcon and Casablanca. He's very much in this because of the fact that he needs to be with Jonathan, otherwise he gets in trouble himself, which it's funny he ends up not getting in trouble himself. And I love I love his anxiety that we see throughout this film, and it's just such a wonderful performance. John Alexander's Teddy is absolutely terrific, and I mean the way he fully commits to the shtick, which I mean it is shtick, and it's like basically playing off of you know Teddy Roosevelt, playing off going up the stairs every time, and just it's hilarious. It really is hilarious. It's this movie is all about setting up caricatures and archetypes of characters and then just twisting it just a bit.
Yeah. You mentioned Casablanca. I was reading a lot of the like behind the scenes stuff. I like doing that. It's the Epstein brothers wrote this. I'm like, what? Like it's one of those kind of mind blowing things. I like that because I like that they shot this the same year as Maltese Falcon. Laurie shot this the same year, which is it's amazing to me to think that he played that different of characters, even though it is very Peter Lorre. I like
Yeah.
that they shot this in '41, and then Capra enlisted in World War II with the reserves, and so he went and fought and stuff like that. And I guess Jack Warner had decided while the movie was shelved until Capra could come back, he went ahead and showed it to a lot of the troops. And so Capra was out there in the field, and people would be yelling, "Charge!" And he'd be like, "Where did that come from?" And he found out that Jack had been showing it to soldiers just to kind of liven their moods out there.
Yeah.
So, and then also, I think with the play, the guy that wrote the play, he wrote it as Kesselring, I think that's pronounced his name, but he wrote it as kind of the genteel. It's the genteel, like, oh, you'd never these loving, doting aunts, like, who also happen to have 12 bodies, like, buried in the basement. It's like that whole idea of the farce of we don't really know what these people are up to, and they're so charming, the aunts, that we even are okay with their casual racism.
Yeah.
Jonathan comes in with a body, and they're like, oh, we don't want the foreigner buried with the guys that we
Oh
killed.
my God, yes.
And it takes you a minute. You're like, wait, what? What did they just say? Yeah, so it's funny how even that's kind of, because you're buying into the madcap farce of it. It's like, it's so, I hate that I just barely watched this. I wish that I'd seen this like decades ago, because it is just a joy. Same as, and it is, it's weird having that kind of the Clue connection to it, having them kind of be similar with the manicness and with the Curry Grant kind of the glue holding everything together. There's a scene in Clue where they come in and they find the maid dead. They all walk into the room and they're just, this has happened so often, they're like, ugh, this. So they all walk in, they all walk out. It's the same thing when, like, when Jonathan and the answer, he's like, no, I've killed more people. I've killed 13 people, and they're counting, which is also like when they were counting the gunshots in Clue. I think there's a lot of similarities. I didn't read anything, but I'm curious to know if when they were writing Clue, if this was an inspiration for it.
It wouldn't surprise me. It really wouldn't.
Johnny, did you see any similarities? Did you have a Clue kind of throwback?
It definitely has a similar feel. I definitely see why you can compare those two. I wanted to quickly talk about Cary Grant's eyes, just because they're so expressive. I talked about Paul Newman's, piercing blue eyes, and his are expressive too. But man, Cary Grant, his eyes are dark brown, but yet you still can see everything he's thinking.
Yeah.
I just love that. That's to me, that's what acting's all about. And when I can see that, that's what these actors gain my respect.
I think my favorite scene in the entire movie is when Jonathan is tied up, Mortimer, and the police officer comes in, and he's like, "Wait a minute, you haven't heard my play," and he starts. And to your point, Johnny, the way Cary Grant's eyes basically do all of his acting for him in that
Yeah.
scene, it's just marvelous, and I laugh so hard every single time during this movie. It's a movie that, I mean, if it wasn't for movies like this, I don't know that something like Clue would have stuck with me the way it did. And I mean, it's the type of, so many comedies nowadays. It's like, oh, they've got to be comedy dramas. It's like, because of the fact that romantic comedy tropes don't necessarily work the way they used to now, where it's like, you get together a large cast of characters and let them work off of one another, and it will work. I mean, it will absolutely work. And this movie is just so wonderful, and I love the fact that it's like you get a sense of the way things are without seeing it. Like, we never see Panama.
Yeah.
We never see the basement where the bodies are buried, but we can still picture it in our minds of what it would be like. The fact that the body being the fact that the bodies end up switching places as far as which bodies in the window
Window seat.
Yeah, it's just wonderful, and it's every single moment, and I love this movie so much.
Well, we talked about The Sting hitting all the specific beats that a con movie should hit, right? I think that this movie hits all the beats that a farce should hit. And
Yeah.
I think it all comes to a head. The part, like you mentioned, when they have Mortimer tied up, and you think he's going to be killed. You think they're going to go and do the torture. He's going to take it really slow. But then Einstein is like, I need a drink. And he's, I think I saw some wine over there. We see it register in Grant's face, like, oh, the wine, like he can get away with this. And you're, oh, they're going to take a drink. They're going to take a drink. But then Teddy comes out and blows the horn, which gets them to drop this. And so you're disappointed, but of course you're slapping your head going, of course.
Yeah.
Of course that would happen, right? But then, of course, him blowing the horn calls the cops back. It's so well structured, and it fits. I'm not too familiar with the play, so I'm not sure if it did that in there. But as far as the movie goes, just because you don't see it coming, even though you should have. Oh, the wine, of course. Oh, the trumpet, of course. Oh, the cops are going to come back, of course, right? All this stuff. It's so well structured. I think because we're watching the comedy, we're watching Grant's performance, it's hard to not be dazzled by the writing. But the dialogue is great, the structure of it is great, the again, all the manic energy is just great. I think again, why haven't I watched this movie before last week?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this is a movie where I love that this movie has one last twist for us by the end, where it's like we where Abby and Martha are like, are you sure that those signatures are gonna be all right? It's like, yeah, it'll be fine. They won't look up Dr. Einstein. It's like, no, yours. And we get the truth about Mortimer, but the funny thing is that even though we believe that they're telling the truth about Mortimer's true parentage, we also see why he almost fits in so well with this family, because of the fact that he is, as much as he doesn't want to have the same, even though he doesn't necessarily want to be associated with these people for one reason or another. He ultimately is very much one with the way that this family turned out, which is kind of crazy.
Yeah, because it's not necessarily the blood that makes us; it's the relationships.
Yeah.
And their upbringing. Again, I don't think that's necessarily the point they're trying to make, but they do
No,
kind of weave that all the way through. So you're right. When they have that twist in the end, it's like, of course.
Well, Johnny, did you have anything more to say about Arsenic and Old Lace?
No, I think we pretty much covered it.
Okay.
Watch it.
Yeah,
if you
watch
haven't seen Arsenic and Old Lace, it's a blast.
Criterion released it a couple of years ago. It's well worth picking up. It is just a delight. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me. I'm so glad we were able to do this. I'm so glad we were able to talk again. It's always great to talk to you guys. And, I definitely want to do it again in the future.
I don't know why we don't do this more. It's just friends getting together and just talking. I know Johnny and I do it like weekly or every other week, but it's like, why don't we invite other? It's really no trouble like bringing somebody else on to chat about movies. That's one of the things that's great about you, Brian. Is again kindred spirit. We talked about this on Rad. We talked about this on Rainmaker. Is like it's just friends just chatting about movies. We've got obviously a passion for the stuff that we watch. Behind the scenes stuff and in front of the camera. So yeah, I don't know why we don't do this more often. We should make more dates like this to be able to watch movies and just talk about them.
Yeah.
Well, I need to set the record straight. I think Darin's actually the better looking one out of the two of us.
Oh, it depends on what time of the day it is, Johnny.
But Brian, when you're on the show, you're the better looking one.
Yeah, we can agree on that.
I don't know how that's humanly possible, but okay. I'll take it. I'll take it. I'll take a compliment on my own podcast. That's fine.
You're a fine piece of work, Brian. Just gotta say. You're a nice slab of meat. I appreciate you.
You're the only one I'm looking at this whole time, so
So before we wrap it up though, where can we find Nostalgia Cast online, and where can we find you guys online?
Johnny, can we find you online?
Not me.
Johnny's wise in that he stays off of Twitter and off of Facebook.
Yes.
But if you want to find Nostalgia Cast, which you talked about, just again, I'm on Twitter. I'm just at DW Lundberg. I post all the stuff about our shows. Like you talked about, Ryan, we're covering 70s movies right now. We just covered Apocalypse Now, and during the episode I thanked Johnny because I was like, I love this movie. This movie is one of my all-time favorites, and watching it this last time kind of solidified that. So that's really what Nostalgia Cast is all about. It's kind of sharing and what Sonic Cinema is all about. It's just sharing in the love of movies, no matter what topic, no matter what genre we're talking about. It is just the ideal of getting friends together, just enjoying movies together.
No, absolutely. And yeah, Johnny, I think is definitely the wiser of the three of us as far as staying off social media, especially Twitter.
If you want to be liberated and have some freedom, get off it.
I don't get no. Yeah, I mean, I've gotten as far as occasionally taking it off my phone and certainly not getting notifications for it. So, I'm kind of getting there, but yeah, it's like occasionally there's just something so bizarre that shows up that it's like, yeah, that's kind of why I can't really get rid of this site as much as I hate it. But no, I mean, check out Nostalgia Cast. It's been it's wonderful to listen to. These guys are so much fun to talk to, and I definitely look forward to doing more talking with you guys in the future. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, Brian.
I'd like to thank Darin and Jonny for joining me on the podcast today. It was a pleasure to talk to them again. Check out Nostalgia Cast. Check out our episodes we did on Rad and the Rainmaker. It was a lot of fun to record with them, and I loved recording with them now. The schedule for this podcast, admittedly, is going to be kind of up in the air. There are definitely episodes I want to get to this year. The question is whether I get to them or not and when I get to them. But I definitely want to get to them at some point this year. That's going to be it for this episode of the Sonic Cinema Podcast. Once again, check us out wherever you listen to podcasts, whether it's YouTube, Apple, Spotify, Good Pods, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Check us out at patreon.com/Sonic Cinema, as well as, of course, www.sonic-cinema.com.